We want to go ahead and talk a little bit today about the opening battles of the Revolution and some of the early events that really started off the fighting and what became the American Revolution. The first, of course, would be the battles at Lexington and Concord. These are kind of the shots that hurt around the world, and takes place just outside of Boston. The British originally went to Lexington and Concord not to engage in a battle. Rather, what they went for was they heard that the colonists were gathering weapons in Lexington and Concord. There was a stockpile of both ammunition and guns there, and they went to go ahead and confiscate those guns and ammunition. The idea was they wanted to discourage the colonists from forming these militias. They wanted to go ahead and assert their authority that the colonists would not be allowed to threaten the order of the British Empire. What ended up happening was the British go ahead and they get ordered to go to Concord, and the colonists are ready for them. This is Paul Revere's famous ride, "The British are coming, the British are coming." One if by land, two if by sea. The lanterns up in the bell tower, and so the colonists are warned, and the colonists begin to gather. And so when the British get to Lexington, which is before Concord, they find that there's a group of colonists gathered there on the green, assembled, and the first shots are then fired there at Lexington. It's not a big deal actually, as far as that conflict goes. As far as the number of casualties, that's not massive casualties. There's only one British soldier who's wounded. 8 colonists are killed in that. But again, this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Now all of a sudden there's blood being shed, not the British intent. And so what ends up happening is the British commander, realizing that, hey, this is a bad situation, decides, okay, before it gets any worse, before we end up killing more colonists and we have another altercation, let's go back home. So he decides to take the column and go back to Boston rather. This is where the colonists really go ahead and begin to employ tactics that will serve them very well throughout the rest of the Revolution. They employ what are called guerrilla tactics, meaning that they're hit and run. They're not going to stand up and fight the British head on. They're going to take some shots, and then they're going to run away. They're going to hide behind trees. They're going to hide behind embankments and different things like that and shoot from covered positions. And in fact, the British in this regard were easy targets. They wore the bright red coats. They were in the open along the road. And it's really on the retreat back to Boston. The British suffer pretty heavy casualties as the Americans begin picking them off one by one. And there's no way to really fight them because the British are used to fighting using infantry tactics where they all line up and they face their enemy and stuff like that. So this really kind of caught the British off guard and proves to be one of the more successful tactics that the Revolution can use, the patriots can use for the rest of the Revolution. Really, one of the first significant victories for the patriots would be Ticonderoga. In Ticonderoga, we go ahead and we show up. Ticonderoga is a fort up on Lake Champlain. It's out in the middle of nowhere. It was meant to protect fur traders and trade routes on Lake Champlain in upstate New York. And what ends up happening is the Patriots show up because they know that there's cannons there, and they want to go ahead and take those cannons. The British soldiers who were there in no way thought that they would ever actually see any type of opposing force, and so they flat out weren't ready. Literally, the Patriots show up. They knock on the door. The British are like, "Who's there?" And they storm in, and the British are caught sleeping in their beds, completely unprepared for a fight. And so they go ahead and the Americans capture the fort, and more importantly, capture the cannons that are in that fort. And that's going to come into play here in just a little bit. The Battle of Bunker Hill then takes place outside of Boston. You'll recall that with the Intolerable Acts, the British had basically taken over Boston and declared martial law. The Battle of Bunker Hill is what kicks the British out. First thing is it actually doesn't take place on Bunker Hill. There was an error in reporting it. It takes place actually on the hill next to it, Breed's Hill. But since the error in the papers, the local papers of the time, said it was at Bunker Hill, the name's kind of stuck, and it's referred to often as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill actually overlooks Boston Harbor, and the reason why that's significant is that from the top of that hill, with cannon, with artillery, you could command the entire harbor, and that's why the colonists wanted it. And so the colonists put the cannons up on top of Bunker Hill, and the British realize that they're vulnerable, that their fleet is bottled up in Boston Harbor, and so they have to go remove those cannons. That's when the battle ensues. So what actually happens? The British were going ahead preparing to attack the colonists. Once again, just like in the case of Lexington and Concord, the colonists heard about it because, again, all the folks in Boston, they didn't want the British around. So as soon as they see the British starting to amass to get out of town, to go confront them, they go ahead and get word out, and the colonists begin preparing. And they erected overnight fortifications, literally just digging trenches and ditches and putting up some makeshift berms and battlements to go ahead and fight the British. So the British go ahead and they show up, and quite frankly, they felt like they were just going to walk in there and the colonists would be caught off guard. They go ahead and take the cannons, and that would be that, and there'd be a small skirmish or something. But when they show up, they realize the colonists are up on top of this hill, and they're behind a fortified position. At this point, if the British had been smart, they probably would have gone back to Boston and said, "Okay, let's rethink this. How else can we do this?" But they don't. They go ahead and they say, "Hey, we're the British. We know what we're doing." They mount a frontal assault straight up the hill. They suffer very heavy casualties. They win the battle, but they lose a lot of soldiers in doing so. And further, once they got up to the hill, they found that the cannons had been moved. It's the Battle of Bunker Hill where they, the patriots, the Americans, famously say, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." It's because they didn't have any ammunition to lose. The Americans didn't have bullets, and they couldn't afford to waste any. So they let the British get almost all the way up the hill before they can go ahead and open fire from behind their fortified positions. And that's another reason why the British suffer such heavy casualties. The net result of that is the British are in fact forced out of Boston. The cannons from Ticonderoga, the British cannons that they didn't adequately defend and that the Americans took from them, go ahead and force the British to remove their ships from Boston Harbor, and they go up to Canada. They would eventually return, and then they would go ahead and capture New York City. They wouldn't go back to Boston. Boston is free of them, and that's it. For all intents and purposes, the Battle of Bunker Hill frees Boston from the British. They will never again be under British control. At this point, the colonists realize things are getting crazy, and so they go ahead and they offer their last ditch effort to try to mend the situation in the Olive Branch Petition. This is again an appeal directly to the crown, to the king. Hey, we don't want to revolt. We want to be British. We are British. We like being British. Can you please go ahead and get rid of these acts that have offended us and that has caused this rift between Great Britain and the colonists? And it goes on deaf ears. It's ignored. Last thing that really pushes things over the edge to the revolution is actually a pamphlet published by a guy by the name of Thomas Paine called Common Sense. It was meant to incite anti-British feelings and encourage revolution. It represents the king as a tyrant, and by and large, this is the narrative that takes hold. And the colonists do begin to think of the king as a tyrant, and the effect is absolutely enormous. The only other document that was more widely read back in the day was the Bible itself. And so this is really a turning point where the colonists begin to turn not only against the Parliament in Great Britain, but also against the king.